Welcome to the Men of Valor program. Today we're continuing our series with Debbie about factors that help a wife build trust and some of the things the husband can do, some of the things that are important to the wife. And so far, for those of you that have been listening currently, I think we've talked about 6 points so far, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And now we're going on to number 7.
Right. So I'm hoping this is practical for everyone, and so if it isn't, I'd appreciate your feedback about that because I'm kind of a practical person, and I know when we're rebuilding trust, there are a lot of things that are very specific to doing that. Point 7 is a little bit more global, I guess, in our thinking about it because it's what I identify as longing to see internal motivation in a spouse who's broken your trust.
Right.
And internal motivation is different than what we might typically see, which we sometimes label as external motivation. And as you were saying, maybe describes more of the specific things someone might do because someone's asking them to do something or someone else is watching them. They're afraid of someone's reaction.
Right.
They're trying to please someone, keep someone from hurting.
Right.
So they're external motivators that lead any of us to change what we're doing. But internal motivation is more of that place of someone wanting to do what they're doing to be the best version of who they can be.
Well, to be the men, in this case, that God calls them to be, regardless of other people's reaction. I do think this is a long spiritual journey. I think it begins, even at the beginning. And we are grateful in the early days for external motivations because it keeps the addict sober. But gradually we're trying to work on, they will do whatever it takes. They have that heart change. They're humble, they're broken, and they are spiritually pursuing this because, again, they want to be the men that they are called to be. So.
I think on the front end of the journey, too, sometimes as a husband and a wife, we create a number of externally motivated things to try to keep him safe, you all safe, and to reduce anxiety for a spouse. And so some of those things might be that she might agree to be an accountability partner for her husband on the front end, or she might be asked to be in that role.
Well, in terms of getting reports from like Covenant Eyes or something like that.
Right. Or she may be asked by her spouse, I've heard a number of times, to ask him how he's doing.
Yeah. Okay.
She's invited into that role. She may be invited into a role of accompanying him whenever he's traveling, let's just say, if he happens to do a lot of that for work. So she may be asked to hold all the passwords to everything. She may be asked to put the controls on the television or to monitor the remote. There are a lot of things that she may either decide she wants to do or she is asked to do. And some of those things on the front end can be helpful to reduce anxiety, as I said. And
for her.
For her.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe even for him, actually, to know that there's someone else watching over his program. All that to say, though, I do know that eventually those are not the kind of things that build long-term trust for a woman. And that came out clearly in my research as well when I asked several hundred women about these issues of building trust. And what I learned is one of the most important things was a heart change that they saw in their husband, which I think refers to this internally motivated place to want to be a different person at all costs. Other things like counseling, being willing to tell the truth, some of these other things we've also talked about were those things that were definitely more trust building for her. And what's interesting is the least helpful things that came up on that research were the externally motivated things.
Yeah. Well, I like the accountability software and stuff like that, right?
Yes, right. So it's not to say that it's not important, but it became less and less important in terms of building long-term trust.
Well, I think part of what happens there is that the husband is taking upon himself the responsibility for that accountability, and he's giving the accountability to some of his male community. So as opposed to the wife getting the reports or the wife having to ask, he's building up his community such that the reports are going to some of his brothers. If they see something, they are calling them, they are dealing with it. And it's all because he is more internally motivated, regardless of what the wife is doing to, be sober. So, yeah.
And I think for you wives too, you'll find that it is an important shift for you when there's a shift from the external to the internal, in that it hopefully releases you too from becoming what might start feeling like a parent to your spouse.
Right.
When you are in an accountability partner role for him, or if you're always accompanying him places or not leaving him alone, I think eventually you begin to feel like your life is one of just taking care of him rather than partnering with him.
You're like a mother as opposed to a partner.
Exactly.
Right.
So I know for them as well, for all of you wives, that knowing that he is finding that an internally motivated place, and the other men in his life who can help him with whatever external motivators he needs, releases you to just be a wife and a partner instead of a mother or a parent.
I think one of the symptoms of it is when the husband starts volunteering without being asked information about his sobriety. So she doesn't have to ask him, "Are you sober today?" He'll tell her first. Maybe they're doing one of the couples exercises like Thanos, which we've talked about here on the show. But in the meantime, he's just going to wake up on a given day and say, "Today's a good day. Today I'm working my program. Today I'm sober. Here are some of the things I'm doing for my program." I think that's very important for the wife. And he's volunteering the information rather than feeling like he's being supervised about it.
That's what strikes me as a key point there, Mark, because doesn't it tend to help the wife feel like she's being, like he's not trying to hide things by involving her in his accountability? It kind of breaks down that wall of, I wonder what's really going on with him.
Yes, I think you're right, Randy. And it's volunteering and sharing parts of yourself, all parts of yourself, what you're feeling, what you're thinking, what you're needing, that help build trust with her.
Yeah.
And so that's different than asking her to be an accountability partner. When you share with her what you're doing for your accountability and who's helping you with it, that's different than calling her into that role.
Especially when she reflects back on all the things that triggers their past history, where she knows he was lying, he was hiding things that he was doing from her. I mean, I would think that there would be a relief or a confidence that would start to grow in that trust if he's turning to her to share those things.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. Well, another point that I just noted in terms of building trust in the relationship when it's been broken is the idea to see our spouses get rid of any hypocrisy in their life. And by that I mean working on being the same person in public as you are in private.
Right.
To work on authenticity.
Yeah, we were just talking about a case like this at lunch today, weren't we? Where the husband presents himself as everybody's best friend. He's very charismatic, very dynamic. But when the wife is coming in, she's reporting a very different person at home. And that's not congruent, is it? So
that's right. And, again, we're talking about things that are larger than just sexual behaviors. Right. We're talking about things of character.
Right.
But what I find is that when wives see their husband working on dimensions of new character, becoming more Christ-like in their life, those things build trust.
Right.
And this is one of those. I know I work with women who, for instance, their spouses might be in positions, say, in ministry or leadership, and yet no one there knows anything about the life they're struggling with in their private lives. And so they go about being really kind of a different person when they're out there serving or in their career, but at home it looks very different.
Don't you think some of the wives protect that at some point? By that I mean, some of the wives are just like a ministry. I'm thinking of the ministry examples, of which there are legion numbers of those, where I simply mean I think there's sometimes some fear that if we get out there, particularly with ministry populations, what the husband is really like at home, then it'll be career ending and that kind of thing. So, well,
I think you're right. It can sometimes be a coupleship issue that is perpetuated because of fear of what will happen to us financially if things are found out and careers are crashed or whatever. Right. I think that's where my work with wives becomes important, is to try to just explore what that's about and to decide at some point. What I know is at some point, again, living authentically on both sides of this for her and for him is what begins to build intimacy and trust between the two of you. Right. And I would say that also this hypocrisy doesn't show up just in careers. I think it can show up in lots of other ways. Sometimes maybe a husband has lost his job, but maybe what's known in the family is just that he decided for whatever reason it wasn't a good fit and he thought he might change a job, and so the truth of that isn't known. Or someone is fired from work and the world believes that maybe he just decided to retire, quit, or whatever, rather than what was really going on there. Or children are told that dad just has to work an awful lot and that's why he's not home, when maybe the truth is he's spending some of his days incarcerated. And so there are lots of stories that bump us off of this authentic place in our relationships. And I do know and believe that kids are smart too. They sniff out hypocrisy very, very easily. And I think we all too are disturbed by it. It does create distance in our relationships with others. And I think there are ways that sometimes we need, for privacy's sake, not to share things, but in many ways we can be authentic about how we answer things and what information we're giving people that are true about our lives.
And that's part of that internal motivation too, to be congruent, to be authentic, to be honest. And it's part of the journey. It's hard to do sometimes if we've had a history of lying and trying to be somebody we're not for so many years. So, all right. Well, do you want to move on to number 9, and we'll maybe conclude with that one today?
Yeah, I think number 9, that would be
Okay.
a great final point for today's show.
Okay.
And this is a lot of great information for our listeners to be processing, and some terrific guidance.
Yeah. And again, we're talking about building trust with another person. And I guess as we move along in this list, I realize that some of this trust building is way more than about just trust around behaviors and sexual behaviors. This is about trust in the person that you believe your spouse is and want to have them be. And so it's more about character building at some point.
Right.
So this next point is one that I call living out your spiritual leadership. And the reason I call it that is because I think for many of the men that I see coming here for help, they are tremendous leaders, very charismatic, outgoing. And I think for many of them, they have been in leadership positions, whether it's in career, in churches, in their own families. And I think it's wonderful that they have those gifts and talents to do that. What I find, though, for spouses is that I think there's a recognition at times when being the leader is not really what builds trust for them, but wanting them to be led and to work on their own spiritual growth, to be the person to be led rather than the one trying to lead other people when it's clear they're still struggling about things for themselves, builds more trust for a wife.
Yeah, I think being a leader all the time is one of the ways to avoid looking at yourself. You're leading everybody else, you're caring for everybody else, you're really good at that, but you're not looking at your own stuff. And I think there needs to be a time in the first year, maybe even 2 of recovery, where, kind of husbands don't lead anything, at least out there in the public. And they certainly need to look at, what their role is in the home. But we're really trying to help the husband and wife become companions in that spiritual journey also.
And this is maybe a little bit connected to the hypocrisy one, but I know we met up with a client not too long ago who shared with us a beautiful story about this, living out his spiritual leadership in his home. And I know some of the arguments that he and his wife had were a lot about how he parented their children, rather dictatorial, demanding this and that of them, expecting things, wanting them to get up in the morning bright and early, get to their homework, all of these kinds of things. But what he shared with us one night was that he realized that he wasn't living out those very things he was expecting of others in his life.
Right.
And he said, I simply one day made a change in how I began to live my life of leadership in my family. And he said, I began to do the things that I wanted others to do.
More about service at points.
Well, it was, and about modeling.
Modeling, yeah.
He said, so I started out, first of all, by getting up every morning at 6 a.m., and I'm not a morning person. And that led to other things in my family. And he said, what I began to realize was the calm that started settling over the family and the trust that I think they were building in me, that I was being congruent in my own leadership and living out what I believed to be a spiritual life, that others wanted to do that and follow along with that as well.
Sure.
That strikes me as the huge point you were making about the wife identifying changes that he's making internally. I mean, that would be like the ultimate guy who's not, who was dictatorial with the kids, but not leading the same kind of example in his own life. And then he made that decision one day, and that had to have opened her eyes to a huge effort on his part.
Yeah, he's really changing. And that's the kind of change that I think builds trust.
Right.
And
Point 9.
point 9.
Yeah. Well, anyway, that's point 9. I think we need to maybe end the show for today. We'll continue this with point 10 next week, I think.
That'd be perfect. And as we always do, taking these 3 points that you addressed today, put a pretty bow on it for us. And what would you like to leave our listeners, the thought you'd like to leave our listeners with, having said what you have shared today?
The final word.
The final word.
And now the final word.
The final word. Well, the final word might be that while infidelity and betrayal bring us into this journey and break a lot of trust in our relationship, I think ultimately the things that lead us out of that place and build trust are much more about the character building that we're committed to, any of us for that matter, have less to do about specific behaviors and more about really sanctification and working on becoming the person that God calls us to be.
Yeah, I was thinking about the word sanctification. Yeah, good. That's a good place to stop.
Okay.
All right.
Well, you have been listening to Mark and Debbie Laaser. I'm Randy Everett, your co-host, and we thank you again for joining us as we continue on this series, When You've Broken Her Trust. We hope that this coming week is going to be a week for you that's filled with many blessings and great vision.